Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Gondo Berry wash processed Kenya from Cloud Picker Coffee Roasters. And there's the box right there. And I actually do like their boxes. But Cloud Picker, based out of Dublin, Ireland, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel. This is a coffee roaster I had a limited familiarity with going into this review. This is also part 2 of our 4-part series featuring the Right Roasts Ireland subscription box. And truth be told, this is one of the coffees I was least excited about, mostly because it is a wash processed Kenyan coffee, and I did have a little bit of familiarity with the profile of this coffee roaster, which is to say that it's not necessarily in line with my own preferences. But with all of those things, I was still curious to see how this one might compare to the other coffees that we're going to be discussing in this box. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So as I kind of alluded to, it's not necessarily in line with my own preferences, as this one is also on par with a lot of the Dublin or Ireland based coffee roasters, which is to say it skews a little closer to that medium side of things, as once again I think that this is also technically their filter roast, but even then you can definitely tell that this is on the more developed side of things. So depending on how you want to kind of label it, it's either going to be a medium or on the slightly lighter side of that medium, but even then you can definitely tell that there's a fair bit of development to this one. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the first thing I noticed was those ever so slight smoky qualities with a notable bit of development. And as I kind of alluded to, I do have a limited familiarity with this coffee roaster, as there is a coffee shop that has carried their coffee from time to time nearby, and as a result I've had an opportunity to try a number of their coffees, and the main reason I haven't necessarily purchased from them in the past is mostly because of the profile of those coffees. So it wasn't necessarily too much of a surprise given that that was the initial impression of this one. It was followed by a fair bit of the classic Kenyan attributes, including some brightness, savoriness, and the tart berries, lending itself towards a pretty okay first impression. Day 19 opted for the Chemex, and the cup was a little better, as there was notably more sweetness in the listed pastry sense. So I think they have something along the lines of a strawberry Danish or something like that, and it made a lot of sense because there really was a very notable pastry quality to it, and it coincided with a lot of those red berry components to it. So it made a lot of sense, especially with that sweeter profile to it. More of the red berry aspects with a very red toned theme to the cup, as expected, better. So we move on to day 22 as we opted for the April brewer, and there was a nice balance of the entirety of the coffee, with it still slightly hindered by those developed qualities, but it was made up for by that pastry-like sweetness complemented by those red berry aspects. So still quite a few positives to take away, even with that profile that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. Move on to day 25 as we opted for the V60 with the Right Roast recipe, and it was actually an AeroPress recipe, so it probably wasn't ideal to brew it with either the V60 or with the Chemex, but I still went for it anyway, and it was a significantly toned down recipe, so that's why I was going to go with that direction anyway. So I said I might as well try it with the V60, see what happens. And it was more dominated by those robust and smoky qualities, as I feel like, once again, toning down the temperatures didn't necessarily tone down that quality of it. It toned down a lot of the more intense and enjoyable qualities, most specifically those red berries as well as that pastry quality. Still, hidden Kenyan aspects underneath, with a little bit more of it being pronounced in the finish, but the smokiness still lingers a bit as well, somewhat hindering the overall experience. Day 28 through the Chemex with the Right Roast recipe, and similar issues to the previous day, as the trade-off did not necessarily feel worth it, as it was lacking a lot of the more enjoyable Kenyan aspects, with those being toned down in place of a little bit more of the smokier qualities. So more adjustments were needed, and I said, why don't we just go back to scratch, go back to the start. And on day 31, we did so through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it was notably better than the previous days, but I can say that it still wasn't necessarily at its peak, as it was offering plenty of those red tones being prominent, the most prominent aspect within this coffee, kind of followed by that slightly smoky aspect. Listed plum felt the most apt it had been up to this point, with additional fruit aspects, lending itself towards a much better experience this time around. But on day 34, things really seemed to change quite a bit as we opted for the Chemex with our standard recipe. And honestly, especially based off the first impression and then this most recent impression, it really was day and night between the two brewers, as for whatever reason, every time we brewed it with the Chemex, it turned out significantly better than the V60. And I don't say that too often. Most of the time it's pretty close between the two brew methods, but this time I can say it was just really a stark contrast between those two brewers, as this time it was offering just such terrific pastry sweetness with plenty of the lovely bright fruit aspects as well, and they were much better defined. And I think that's one of the really big selling points to me on that adjustment, is just how much definition and structure there was with that ever so slight adjustment from the brewers themselves. So this one was definitely the best day I'd experienced, and it was actually quite an enjoyable day. Then going back in that direction on day 37 also lent itself towards that experience, as I ran out of space for a lot of the notes, as it was at its best with less smokiness. And that was the other thing, was I was experiencing less of that. So as a result, a lot of the qualities in this one were much better through that brew method. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a lot of level 4, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish, level 4. Might as well talk about that alongside of the acidity, because I continue to always say that when it comes to wash processed Kenyan coffee, something went horribly wrong if both of those things aren't scoring at the level 4. And the finish definitely kind of finishing in not only that brighter, more classic Kenyan tart berry sense, but in addition to that, it did finish with that ever so slight smoky quality. But by the time that we had made the adjustments, those were all notably toned down relative to some of the other experiences we had had. So that wasn't even necessarily one of the more pronounced aspects within the finish. If anything, it was a little bit more of that classic Kenyan-like aspect, but most prominently and most enjoyably, a lot of that pastry sweetness, which really seemed to kind of linger in that finish as well. So that was a very enjoyable aspect of this coffee. And as we're on the note of that, the sweetness, which did score at that level 4, that's a huge positive for me, because it's not all the time that Kenyan coffees do score at that level 4 sweetness for me, because I feel like they might be a little bit more focused on the brightness in general. This one, because it really came in that much more pastry quality, a very sugary sort of pastry aspect to it, it was very enjoyable. This one was surprisingly sweet, and I think that that really helped the overall enjoyment of this coffee. So massive credit to them on really being able to highlight and emphasize the sweeter qualities of this one. Florality, level 4, and that is very much in line with what I usually experience from Kenyan coffees, a little bit more of that kind of herbal florality. So I'm of course thinking of that hibiscus-like aspect, as I could definitely feel a fair bit of that within this one. And maybe they wanted to highlight a lot of the other qualities in this coffee above any sort of florality, but for me, I could definitely feel it just as abundant as the majority of Kenyan coffees that we do have. Berry fruit, level 4, and the berry note that they have listed on here is in line with that strawberry. It makes a lot of sense, though for me it still is a little bit more of that tart berry, but I could say that maybe it's not quite as tart as some of the other ones, so maybe that's why they opted for that note specifically, or maybe because there's that very sweet pastry quality to it. But if we're kind of splitting hairs, maybe like a raspberry pastry if we're being very precise. Nonetheless, for me, it did have plenty of those red berry aspects within this one. Bunch of level 3s. We will start with the spice level 3. I think that one along the more, we'll say, floral kind of herbal side of things, as well, and the savoriness is kind of toned down a level 2. I can kind of agree with that too. Yeah, I would say that it had a kind of interesting spice quality that went maybe a little bit in line with the floral aspect, and kind of just a little bit more development, kind of those two blending together seemed to offer just this interesting spiced quality to it as well. Stone fruit, level 3. They do have plum listed on here. I can see that. That's something I do get from a lot of Kenyan coffees as well. And I feel like it was a little bit more articulated when we did make the adjustments. And even then, it wasn't maybe quite as pronounced as that pastry-like aspect of this coffee. So that justified itself at that level 3 mark. Smokiness, level 3. And truth be told, that's, I want to say maybe a little harsh, but it had a little bit more of it than even the Finca Maputo, which we all scored at a level 3. So I feel like that's the only place to put it, is at that level 3 mark, because even when we did tone it down in the coffee, some of the earlier days were definitely justified at that level 3 mark, and even by the end, this one, it was still lingering within the finish. So since it's not something that we typically get from a lot of our coffees, given that the vast majority of them we review are on the significantly lighter side of things relative to this one, it's something that definitely needed to be notated within this tasting wheel. And then body level 3, so medium bodied, has that juicy Kenyan-like body, so that was a really nice aspect of it, given that the brew method we opted for was the Chemex, so that goes to show just a little bit more texture within this coffee. And then the last thing worth discussing is the cleanliness. level 3. And truth be told, that was really hard for me to put there at that level 3 mark, mostly because there was just such nice definition in the rest of this coffee, that pastry-like quality, that red berry-like quality, even the stone fruit-like aspect of this one, the florality. All of these things were pretty well defined, pretty well articulated within this coffee. But of course, what really seemed to hinder it was the fact that it had a little bit more of that slightly developed smoky quality to it, which as a result did seem to kind of hold it back from scoring that true level 4 mark in terms of that clarity. But outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like based off the way I've discussed it, you could probably tell that I actually ended up enjoying this coffee a little bit more than what I might typically enjoy from something in this sort of profile. And that goes to show that even slightly more developed coffees can still have some really wonderful qualities and traits to them, as that's the case with this one right here. This is a little bit of a guilty pleasure coffee, and if you kind of go back and watch maybe some more of those developed Kenyan coffees, and that is actually a little bit of a theme, as oftentimes I end up enjoying these more developed Kenyan coffees, which is kind of funny given that I'm not the biggest fan of Kenyan coffees, and I definitely prefer much lighter coffees in general. So whenever it comes to these and they turn out this way, then it's just kind of interesting, and I feel like the main reason for that is because they just offer a very interesting, sweeter aspect to them, as the case with this one as well. One thing I didn't even mention is there were certain times, especially brewed with the Chemex, that I was experiencing that cherry fruit chew-like quality. So there were just so many of those red, sweeter qualities that were present within this coffee that it made it, once again, a little bit more enjoyable of an experience and a little bit of a guilty pleasure coffee in that sense. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to, obviously we need to start with the profile, given that there's a little bit more development to it. But if you're like me and you can kind of look past that in place of maybe some more sweeter qualities of a Kenyan coffee, then I feel like that's a really good place to start with this one, because the pastry quality in this one is very nice. And I know I've experienced that from some coffees in the past, but I can't help but emphasize just how enjoyable it was and how much it seemed to really carry and help a lot of the profile within this coffee. In addition to that, you're getting depth. I mean, you do have plenty of those classic Kenyan aspects, so the body, the brightness, and the florality, as well as just some fruit qualities, the red berries, as well as those stone fruits. So there's lots to take away from this coffee. So it's not even a one-dimensional coffee, a little bit more depth for a Kenyan coffee as well. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Gondo Peaberry, wash processed Kenya from Cloud Picker Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.